I'm very happy to be here this morning. And before I fully jump into my talk, I just wanted to have a small side note. So I would be ill-advised from my own heart this morning if I had been given this platform and didn't speak a little bit from it. So this is something that I added kind of last minute. It's pretty quick. But much before the recent events, I wrote a talk about love and understanding, which I'm still going to give, because those messages are very important to me. But I feel like due to recent events, it's a more crucial message than ever. So this is a talk about humans, because we're all humans, and that's important. And no matter who you are, it's been a stressful week. It's been emotional. For me, personally, it's been gut-wrenching. But I'm not here to tell you how you should or shouldn't feel. That's kind of the beauty of life. You get to feel it, you get to own the experience. But what I am here to say is that love is a beautiful thing. And that loving your fellow humans, no matter who they are, no matter where they came from, that's really important at this time. But as I stand here in front of a room of mostly white, inevitably privileged humans, I would be silly not to remind us all of that we're all privileged. Some of us had the luxury of taking the day off work. Heck, I had the luxury of flying across the country to be here. I'm super privileged. But not everyone is, so let's remember that during this conference as well. Let's remember to broaden our horizons and build inclusive teams. Let's remember that what we do in here can affect what happens out there. Let's remember that LGBTQ humans are just as important, and that survivors of sexual assault are real and their stories are real. Let's remember that Black Lives Matter. Let's remember that immigrants and diverse backgrounds and individual nuances are what makes this country beautiful. So as we go back to our daily lives after today and build software, some products that are going to affect the future of this country, let's just remember those things. And let's do better to do good. Let's build toward a future where respect, love, and maybe even a hug or two is the norm. Where everyone is allowed, everyone feels safe, and everyone is given the opportunity to thrive. All right. Thank you. All right, now let's get into this thing. So, welcome, DevOps Days Nashville. First one, I'm super excited to be here. And so first DevOps in Nashville, it's actually my first time to Nashville, which is a little bit strange because I grew up in southern Illinois in a town called Belleville, which is only about 300 miles from here. And actually I went to Mizzou for undergrad, and fraternities used to come to Nashville a lot for these things they would call formals. So basically what that was is every frat member got to pick a date, they'd take a bus down here, have an event one night, and basically just like get to have fun on the town the other days. Or at least that's what I'm told. I mean, I was never invited to them. But, you know, it's 10 plus years ago, super not still bitter about it, it's fine. But yes, anyways, so excited to be here. Who am I? I'm Jill Jubinski. Professionally, I am the technical community manager over at Simple, which is an amazing fintech company. Yes, those two words can go together. That's based out of Portland, Oregon. We are very supportive of remote workers as well, as I live in Seattle. Yeah. From an educational perspective, I always like to tell my backstory a bit because I'm a little bit different than most of y'all. I don't have a traditional technical background. My background is in psychology. As I mentioned, I went to Mizzou, and I got my undergrad in a dual major in psychology and sociology, and then went on to Missouri State, got to keep it Midwest, to get my master's in what's called industrial organizational psychology, which is basically the study of human beings in the workplace. It's a pretty broad umbrella. It ranges everywhere from like a legal perspective to research methods and statistical base to learning and development, training, that type of thing. And I feel very fortunate that I have that background because in my role I get to utilize it on the day-to-day. And then personally, my most important job is to be a mother to two beautiful girls, pictured here, Noodle and Bean, my pride and joy. And I, as many other parents of whatever type of humans or non-humans, do what I do so that I can give them a beautiful life. And some of you, sounds very self-important, but it is what it is, may know me from Twitter as @JillJubs or Hug Dispenser. Hug Dispenser is just kind of a joke that started 2.5, 3 years ago at this point. Someone dared me to change it. It was actually at PyCon, another conference. I conference a fair amount, and here we are today. But it's definitely not off-brand. As I mentioned, I'm from the Midwest. I love a good hug. So as I was brainstorming for this talk, because I do have a little bit different background, as I mentioned, I'm not an engineer. But the one thing I guess engineerish about me is that when I go home, I mean, my parents still do ask me to fix the Wi-Fi and ask me to show them the coolest new app, so maybe I'm a junior engineer at this point. But my day-to-day isn't about computers, it's about humans, and understanding how they think, act, feel, react, and how this impacts their work both individually and from a team base. So for this talk, I want to go outside the technical box. I want everybody in the room to take their engineer hats off because I don't want to talk about the cloud. I don't want to talk about infrastructure, configuration management, DevOps, containers, buzzword, buzzword, buzzword. I don't want to talk about computers at all. I want to talk about the one consistent thing amongst all of these things, no matter what section you're in or profession. It's those human beings behind those bright screens. So you may be wondering, why would we have a talk based around humans at DevOps? I mean, we've had a couple of them actually at this point. But it was actually the godfather of DevOps himself who said, DevOps is a human problem. So I think in the DevOps community, we really use this as a tone setter so that when we're talking about technology, we don't forget about all of the other components and nuances that go into making technology even more difficult, which is when you put human beings involved. So as you progress through the talks and the open spaces, I'd love for y'all to remember some of these human factors that I address. My aspirations for the session is just to get everyone questioning and thinking about those individual humans behind the screens. So as kind of alluded to, I've been in this community for about 4 years at this point in the DevOps community. I definitely have people in this room who have been to way more DevOps conferences than I have, but I think I've been to around 15 at this point. And through those years, I've built a lot of DevOps teams as well. So as these things progressed, I started hearing messages that seemed familiar, but I couldn't really pinpoint where they were coming from. And so as I continued on, I did what any good DevOps does, and I did a bit of soul searching to figure out, why had I heard these lessons before? And then I realized that I heard these because I learned them from my family growing up. These weren't new lessons. These were human lessons applied to technology. Imagine that. So my hope for today is that through sharing stories, which I will do, it will help to teach or reteach everyone about these lessons and just to get you thinking. A few pre-warnings before I fully jump in. Take a drink. There's going to be minimal slides in my talk. I don't have a lot of key takeaways or things that you can bring back specifically to your organization, like a step-by-step process, so it's not really necessary. I'll have a few pictures for focal memory points or a little bit of general hilarity. But don't worry, I've done this before, so I realize that every good talk needs an inspirational quote for a great social media moment. So if you can't tell by now, although I am passionate about work and humans, I don't try to take anything too seriously. I think we should all be having a little bit of fun with life as well. So let's have fun today too. So back to those stories. As I mentioned, going to be sharing one pre-warning before I fully jump in is that I'm not here to judge anyone else's life. My life, because I know I've experienced it, is not perfect. There have been ups and downs, good days and bad days, and I'm not here to tell you how you should experience stories that I've told. So if for any reason something feels makes you uncomfortable or feels weird, feel free to work on your laptop or take a step out or whatnot. So just quick pre-warning. And those stories. There's a few key characters involved, so I thought it would be a good chance to introduce them. So meet the crew. This is my family. We're a small group, just 4 of us. First, my dad, Steve, that dapper young gentleman marrying my mom in the middle. My dad was born in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania. Shortly after, his dad was in the Navy, and so they moved to Honolulu, where his dad was stationed. Growing up on the beach, my dad was passionate about things like music, surfing, and being a general menace to society. He often tells me that he doesn't have any friends from that stage in his life because they're all either dead or in jail. It's a beautiful story, I know. So as he was graduating high school, he realized that it was kind of now or never to turn his life around. So he thought a good next step would be to join the military. So he went to a couple different recruiters, and nobody was really interested except for the Air Force recruiter, with the caveat that he had to have 60 college credits to get in. So he did what any good 18-year-old does, and he enrolled in 4 local universities to get 60 college credits in 1 semester. That's what I have to measure myself up to. So 20 years later, 2 kids and a wife, and he retired in Southern Illinois. So this being Veterans Day, it's a very proud day for me and my family as well, as we have a long lineage of military humans. But my dad doesn't like to talk about his military life that much, even though he's done a lot of cool stuff. So I'll leave with a few context clues on him. For a while, we lived in Washington, D.C. My dad is a pilot, and he has something strongly in common with a pair of Nike shoes and a very popular Nelly song. I'll leave it at that. Mom's next. Sue. She is your typical Midwest woman. She was born in Boise, Idaho, moved to the suburbs of Chicago at a young age. Dad was a salesman who took the train into the city every day. Mom was a stay-at-home mom. She has 2 older brothers, and as older brothers do, they picked on her relentlessly. So she developed a pretty thick skin and a wicked sense of humor, which she keeps to this day. Sue was a 4th grade teacher for 35 years, recently retired. She only took a few years off when my sister and I were preschool age, so that she could be a stay-at-home mom. And then my sister, Katie, the one on the left there, although we kind of look similar in these photos, we couldn't be more opposite. She is your classic introvert. She enjoys her alone time, although I don't know if this is just my experience with introverts or this is the general consensus, but my introvert sister is willing to be introvert to the exterior world, but when you get her in a comfortable space with my family, she's more than happy to be sassy back. Her interests growing up included she was in the marching band, played flute. She loves sci-fi. She really loves fast cars, and she still resides in Southern Illinois and loved picking on me then and continues to love picking on me to this day. And then me, Jill, I'm the other one up there. I fancy myself the typical extrovert. I've always been outgoing and social. That's where I get my joy in life. I get teased a lot by my family for growing up being very perfect. Don't worry, that changed. But we tease each other a lot in general. We switched schools a lot growing up, and my dad even says that one time when I switched schools, I was so perfect that on the first day I went in and cured some kid who had polio. But, so that's us. We're a pretty small crew, and we're pretty different, but we're still very close. And maybe that was our first sign of being a little bit DevOps-y, where we're all our individual silos, so we had to figure out how to come together to communicate. But don't get me wrong, it took many iterations over the years. Let's take my mom and I, for example. Sue and I have always been close, but our relationship has had to change over the years in order to be the best that it could be. When I was quite young, my dad was deployed multiple times. I honestly don't remember how many because I was under 10 at the time. But this left my mom alone for months at a time, being a single parent to 2 young girls. I can't imagine how difficult this must be to be a stay-at-home parent while you're trying to hope that your significant other isn't in massive danger halfway across the world. But if I had to guess, I'd say it changed her to her core. I remember her being around my sister and I a lot, but I don't really remember her having many exterior friends at this point in our life. So I kind of became her go-to gal. She shared a lot with me, probably some things that shouldn't be shared between a mom and a young daughter, some things I just didn't understand, some that confused me, and some that made me just feel like a little bit more of a grown-up than I should have. But as life continued, we are still close, and our relationship has had its normal mom and daughter ebbs and flows, ups and downs, but she's always been my rock. Throughout most of my life, I've been riddled with pretty bad anxiety and panic attacks, and she's always my one that I call if I need someone to kind of talk me off that cliff. Even if I'm in a relationship and have a significant other, if it's really bad, I definitely want to call my mom. And as I got older, we started to realize that although we had a close relationship, it could be a lot better. We still bickered a lot. We had a lot of back and forth. And it wasn't until a few years ago when we realized that maybe we should sit down and figure out what the best way to communicate with each other was. It seemed like she wanted to talk to me all the time, and as your typical daughter, I did not want to talk to her all the time. And I would go back and forth with her. Some days I needed her for everything and would spill my guts, and then I would pull back and not talk to her for weeks at a time, which was also unfair. People assume that these kind of sit-down conversations should only happen between people in romantic relationships. But we need our everyday relationships to have effective communication as well. So once we had that sit-down and I stopped over and under-sharing and she stopped texting me what seemed like every 5 minutes, we started to grow closer and we gained a better understanding of each other. There's less confusion, less anger, less irritation, and generally just a lot more fun. Now, it took us about 29 years to get there, but please don't let that be the blueprint. When you're forming new relationships at work, sit down and have those discussions up front. Understand what means of communication are preferred for that person and work together to find the right flow for y'all. This will not only mitigate inevitable communication hiccups you will face, but it will start laying the foundation for a really great, trustworthy relationship. Better workflow with humans you trust equals a more delightful work environment. Now, being an Air Force family is a pretty tough gig. You move around a lot. I mentioned deployments. You really don't have control over a lot of things in your life. In the most cliche statement ever, the only constant about military life is change. The only other constant is humans, if you let them. My sister and I, we've never really been that close growing up. I mean, I guess when we were really young, we played a lot, but I definitely remember her doing things like putting me in timeout because mom told her to, or slamming a lot of doors in my face. It was always hard for us to understand each other. As I mentioned, she's an introvert, so she likes to be alone. That's what makes her feel comfortable. And I'm an extrovert and love to be social. That's where I feel comfortable. So to her, my extroversion tended to look a lot like me showing off. But in reality, I, like most other young siblings, just wanted her approval. Even though we weren't what I would call best friends, we always, at the end of the day, had each other's back when we needed it. Not in the sense that, like, if she got in trouble, I'd cover for her. Like, we weren't there yet. But although I do remember this one time when we were quite young and Dad got Mom a box of chocolates for Valentine's Day and Katie was accused of eating them, when I totally ate them. And Katie said she ate them. It still confuses me to this day, but that's the one outlier. And I've asked her about it, and she doesn't remember, but it happened. Anyways, when times get tough, and they did, with moves, leaving friends, relationships, regular growing up woes, we always made time for each other if we needed it. I've definitely called her in the middle of the night when I didn't have anyone else that I felt like I could talk to, and she's done the same. Now, this is incredibly applicable to work relationships as well, because most of the time, you're not going to be best friends with all of your coworkers. But being surrounded by good humans to whom you can build strong bonds with is key. Why, you might ask? Well, because shit gets tough. No job is perfect. No matter where you are, there are going to be days, weeks, months where you're having to put in extra hours on a project, where shit keeps breaking, or maybe there's an organizational change impending that you don't understand or is making you uneasy. But the humans, that's the constant. And having a group you're bonded to will get you through those shaky times. They will be the light at the end of the tunnel, and they'll be willing to lend an ear if or when you need it. So it's crucial that not only you make time to create those bonds at work, but it's also crucial for organizations to give the space to humans in there to create those bonds. I see a lot of articles about companies saying that individuals or employees stay or leave because of a particular manager, or stay or leave because stock prices. But I've personally, through experience, seen so many humans stay at companies because of other humans at that company. Humans they are bonded to, regardless of what's happening internally. All right, as I previously mentioned, through my early years, it seemed like life came pretty easily for me. I mean, it kind of seemed like that to myself. I was like, this life thing, not so difficult. But that changed about mid-high school years. I, like many other young men and women, were deeply affected by seeing images of perfect-looking models and actors everywhere that I looked. I didn't necessarily want to be one, but I could have stood to look like one. From afar, especially before you really understand life, you imagine that because they look perfect, their life must be perfect too. So if only I could look like them, then my life would also be perfect. I was also one of those kids growing up that I could eat literally whatever I wanted and not gain an ounce. I was very well known for the amount of quarter pounders that I could put down in one sitting. That changed when I turned about 16. And although my diet was definitely ridiculous, I was eating the same but gaining weight and didn't really know what to do about it. I really have no recollection of when, why it happened, but it feels like one day I woke up and I had a pretty intense eating disorder. I kept the struggle a secret from everyone in my life and tried to go on living as normally as possible. No one really seemed to notice, and I would say the most obvious way that someone would have is my senior year, I definitely did play sick a lot so that I could stay home and have, in private, my disordered eating cycles. Now, soon after, it was time for first year of college, which is an exciting time for everybody. It was my first time living away from my family. I joined a sorority. I made a ton of new friends, and I partied a lot. I mean, I was your typical college kid. But unfortunately, it was also a really great opportunity for my eating disorder to kind of fester and grow because as before I had to skip school to be alone in college, as many of you may know, you can kind of do whatever you want whenever you want. That's the beauty of college. It was during this first year of school when I started getting depressed as well. I had all of this really good stuff going for me, like I was at Mizzou, I had new friends, this was awesome. But I didn't feel happy, and I couldn't figure out why that was. So one day, from outside my dorm room, I called my parents and just spilled my guts. I told them everything. I told them all the dirty habits. And if you've ever had an eating disorder or know someone who has, there are a lot of dirty habits. And I told them all of my struggles. I really hate letting people down. That's the perfectionist in me, and I felt like this was going to be the ultimate letdown. I was their perfect kid, and here I was struggling with something that seemed so silly. I mean, why couldn't I just eat normal meals like every other human? And I kind of felt like I imposed it on myself. And then something lovely happened. My parents, who had literally no background or expertise in eating disorders, said, okay, let's make a plan and help you get better, with no judgment at all. I got a counselor. I would call my parents at the end of the day to tell them about my food intake. I even had a calendar that I put a star sticker on if I had a day without disordered eating. Being accountable really worked for me at that time. And I went back to feeling like old Jill. It was awesome. Life moved on. Unfortunately, as you may or may not know, mental health struggles and eating disorders are not typically like a one and done kind of thing. And unfortunately, within a year, it was back and worse than ever. It compounded my internal stress because not only had I failed by getting an eating disorder, but I had failed by not being able to beat it. So it was just very hard on me. And I'll never forget a night that I vividly remember sitting in my sorority basement. I was living in the sorority house at the time, my sophomore year. And my inner self started saying the scariest thing I had ever heard. And it said, "You're never going to get better, and it's just time to get out now." And I've never had a suicidal thought until that moment, and I'll always be grateful for what I was able to do next. I picked up the phone and I called my parents. And they drove 3.5 hours that night to come pick me up from school, no questions asked. I dropped out of school that semester. I lived in my parents' house. Oh, the semester of school, which my parents had already paid for, and they were just actively losing money since I wasn't there. I did a lot of outpatient counseling. Through the years since, I've gotten a great grasp on these types of things, and I had my struggles, but probably about 6 years ago, I got everything under control and am pretty cognizant of when those thoughts start creeping back in. Now, I realize that this is a pretty intense story, but I wanted to share for a couple of different reasons. One, because I'm not ashamed of my struggles with mental health problems, and I'm actually pretty damn proud of myself for becoming the strong woman I am today. But two, because this lesson of trust and compassion and an environment where it's okay to screw up can easily be implemented into your day-to-day life. Imagine if an engineer wasn't afraid of repercussions when they screwed something up or, heck, even brought a data center down. We've all done it. Or if the ability to test and iterate without fear of being called stupid or a failure were there. Imagine the endless amount of ideas that we're potentially missing out on with untrustworthy environments. Imagine the progress in product launches that you could be faltering on. Imagine the endless possibilities if you create a space to fail. Because without a doubt, with enough failure becomes beautiful success. I myself am a great example standing up here of that today. Who knows what would have happened if I haven't been given the space to fail multiple times. All right, the thing about employees, and heck, even all humans, is that they really enjoy knowing that someone cares about them. Like, it feels really good to know that someone gives a shit about you. And in order to build this environment where it's okay to have failure, you kind of have to care too. It's just like part of the deal. The downside is that sometimes companies, organizations, or environments don't allow for that, and that's where shit gets pretty tricky. So as I mentioned, my dad was in the Air Force for 20 years, retired a lieutenant colonel, and I still remember the retirement ceremony. I think I was in 5th grade at the time. I imagine that retirement has to be a pretty scary part of life because one, you've done something long enough to retire from it, and two, because it just means that a completely new phase of your life is starting, and what do you do with that? Well, as you could probably guess from past stories, my dad isn't really the type to just sit around and twiddle his thumbs. So pretty shortly afterwards, he decided he wanted to get back into the job force. Oh, but not just any job. My dad wanted to be a doctor. I know. So in order to do this, he first had to go back to undergrad to get the appropriate undergrad degree, and then medical school, and then residency, and then finally, years later, my dad was a family practitioner. And let's just take a moment to say how much of a saint my mother is for putting up with 20 years of military wifedom and then another 20 or so of dad wants to be a doctor wifedom. One really hilarious thing that came out of dad becoming a doctor was the most interesting dinner conversations that you've ever imagined. When your dad's a resident and you're talking around the dinner table, you will learn everything you've ever and never wanted to know about the particular rotation he is in. So years later, when I was in grad school, Steve was practicing at a local clinic, and it kind of seemed like things would settle down for the Jubinski family, finally. But you know, life doesn't really work like that, does it? Dad started realizing he was working the longest hours he'd ever worked, which is kind of crazy because he'd always worked long hours. But this time, he was spending hours at home playing chart catch-up or talking to patients on the phone that he wasn't able to finish their questions with in clinic. Well, why not just spend more time with them in clinic, you might ask? Well, if you're not familiar with how the medical profession works these days, especially if you're a young practitioner, there is a very set amount of time that you're allowed in minutes to spend with a patient each day. And what if you don't get to all their questions, you might ask? Well, you're just supposed to get over it and move on with your life. Well, that didn't really sit that well with Dad, so he had a really hard time. So he was at a crossroads. He was either going to spend all time after hours with patients on the phone and not get a lot of family time, or he was going to spend extra time with them in clinic and get in trouble, which he did a lot, by more tenured practitioners saying he was spending too much time. Honestly, both options sucked. He spent too many years working towards this goal where he could help people, something that he genuinely loved to do. And here he was at where he thought would be the end, but it was so different than he imagined. So what's next? What's the right choice when your values are so different than the values of your employer? But you've worked your ass off to get there. Well, if you're my dad, you do the only thing that makes sense to you and your heart, and you quit. You leave everything you've worked for because you frankly can't sleep at night knowing that you weren't able to give those humans the care that you wanted to give them, the care that they deserved. I've never been more proud of my dad than when he did that. Now, I realize that's not the right choice for everyone because, life, and also sometimes it's easier to just look the other way and take the paycheck. But that's just not how my dad is built, and that's okay too. Dad now plays the stock market at home. He can never stop doing things. He's a constant learner. But he keeps up with all of his medical licenses. He's always learning more so that he can provide advice to friends and family or whoever might have medical questions. If something happens with one of my friends, I always have them call my dad. And finally, he gets to spend time with that sweet wife of his. Now, I'm not advocating that everyone up and quit their job. I mean, unless y'all want to come work with me at Simple. But what I am saying is that life is short, and it's good to evaluate what's important to you on the day-to-day. No one's job is going to be perfect, but you do your best to create a space where you can care about other human beings to the best of your ability. And if you're up against barriers where that's not available to you, then it's your call what to do next. But I can say with 100% confidence that caring about other humans will not only better their lives, but it will better your life too. Caring about your employees, your supervisors, your peers is a key component of earning respect and trust and will help give people the confidence to do more. Outside of work, it's okay to care about those humans and make time for them too. Actually, it's critical. So make time for your family, make time for your friends. I know that that's hard and not necessarily ingrained in who we are as technologists, but it will be a key component of making you who you are and making you happy. All right, so at this point, you might be sitting there thinking, dramatic pause. Well, this is all good and well, Jill, but it turns out life's a little bit more complicated, and I can't just up and do all these things at once. And to you, I say, good news. That's the last lesson. Changing your life to be some form of perfection is not the expectation. And heck, it's not even the ideal, because everyone's a work in progress. The stories I told happened over the span of 31 years. That's a pretty long time. And heck, I'm still very far from perfect, and so is my family, both individually and as a team. But the key thing is that we're all trying, and that's enough. Some of these things may come easy to you, and some may be a little bit more difficult. Some may have obstacles, which make them harder to accomplish. But I'm asking as a takeaway today is that you try. Be human enough to say, I'm not there yet, but I'd like to be. Or for work examples, maybe our retros have a lot of blame surrounding them and we're working towards changing that, just acknowledging. Or our communication with remote employees is janky at best, but we hear you and we're putting tools and processes in place to make it better. It turns out that because we're all human, we kind of appreciate those statements. A statement of humility and acknowledgement, and a plan to do better, not to be perfect, but just to try. So what now? How do we proceed? I mean, honestly, nothing's really changed from the moment I got up here. I'm pretty certain y'all knew these things as you walked in the door this morning. This is definitely not some kind of revolutionary thought. But what would be revolutionary is that if each of you just did one of these things in your day-to-day life. So do that. Pick one and just try. When you're creating your teams or implementing tools or launching software, think about the humans that are creating it, think about the humans that are consuming it, and think about those humans, as angry as it may make you, that are going to rip it apart and rebuild it down the line. Think about those humans and think about how you can be part in the solution of fixing the DevOps problem. That's it.